Well, good morning. Welcome to Memorial Road. Hopefully you were able to read chapter 3 of the story this past week, getting ready for our services today. So, quick show of hands. Who read the story last week? Excellent, excellent. Who's okay to admit that you did not? That's okay. It's okay. Just week 3. We only have 28 to go, so you probably want to get in the habit of reading these chapters each week. I really enjoyed reading about Joseph this past week. It's one of those stories that you hear a lot growing up, but there's a lot more meaning to the story as an adult. And every time I read that story, and especially this past time, just things pop out to me that I've just never thought about before. Last week, I talked about how we are supposed to be blessings to other people. And I want to pick up right where I left off last week. The idea last week was that the people of God were created to bless the broken world. And a confession that I want to make to you is that it's a lot easier to be a blessing to somebody else when I feel blessed. So in other words, when life is going good and people are healthy and people are happy and things are just going fine, then I find it really, really easy to become that blessing of love and compassion towards other people. But when I don't feel blessed, it's really difficult to become that blessing. You probably experience the same thing in your life. When you don't feel blessed, when the bad stuff happens, when you're frustrated, when your prayers aren't answered, when tragedy strikes, it's really difficult to become that blessing towards other people. My air conditioning went out this weekend, and I took it into a place, and they were gonna, look at it and everything, and they looked at it and came back, and they didn't know what was wrong, but I still had to pay them $50, and then I had to take them to another place, and I was frustrated. And what I found is later in the day, because I didn't really feel that blessed in the moment, I was short with people. I just wasn't being that much of a blessing towards other people. That's why the story of Joseph is so relevant for us. Because when you read through the story of Joseph, there's a lot of things that happen, and he's not blessed. And yet the big question is, can Joseph and can the people of God, because Joseph represents the whole nation, can they continue to be the nation that blesses the world, even in the midst of all this dysfunctional family, this family? Can it still happen? And so when you think about the story of Joseph, the big picture is that God has built this nation. He has said, go bless the world. And the question is, can that still happen? Can the promises of God still continue through all this dysfunction? When you get to the smaller picture of the story of Joseph, here's what you have. Joseph's a normal teenager. He's got a great family. I mean, his dad is Jacob, his granddad is Isaac, his great-grandfather is none other than Abraham. And he comes from this wealthy family. His dad loves him. He's got a cool coat. Everything's going well for Joseph. And you think about it, one day he wakes up out of his bed. It's his bed in his house on his land with his family. He gets up, his dad says, go check on your brothers. Joseph goes and checks on his brothers, and his brothers, out of complete jealousy and hatred, first they throw him in a pit, then they get him out, and Judah has this great idea that they're going to sell them to these Egyptian merchants which are passing through. And so Joseph, he wakes up in the morning, again, his house, his bed, his family, and that night he goes to sleep in shackles as an Egyptian slave, thinking that he's never going to see his family again. That's a drastic turnaround. So he starts as this favorite son, and then in the course of just a day or two, he becomes this rejected slave. And then the Bible has this really strange verse. In chapter 39, verse 2, the Bible says this, very simple, the Lord was with Joseph. Now, I read that verse and I kind of think, what? God, when you're with people, they don't get thrown into cisterns. And when you're with people, they don't get sold into slavery. And when you're with people, they sure don't lose their families. So how can you say that you're with Joseph when you haven't done one single thing to help him out? He just got hijacked by merchants. You're not with people when those things happen to them. Think about it this way. Remember, a few years ago when the story came out about these women who had been kidnapped by this guy for 10 years. And the story came out, and these women were released, and Ariel Castro went to jail. And when you watch that show, or when you watch that when it came out on the news, are you going to go up to those ladies and say, hey, God, he was really with you when you were being kidnapped for 10 years? You don't say that to people when bad things are happening. You would never say that to someone going through a tragedy. And so it's hard, because at this point in the story in Genesis 39, how do you justify the presence of God in this story when God has done nothing? He's done nothing useful. Well, the odd thing about Genesis and a lot of books in the Old Testament is that they don't tell us the answers to these questions. If you flip over to the New Testament always has great passages and explanations for why things are happening. When you're in the Old Testament, it's just narrative. And so the story just continues. And so as the story of Joseph continues, he starts out as this favorite son, and then he becomes this rejected slave, and he gets to Potiphar's house. And Joseph is so good at taking care of things that eventually Potiphar promotes Joseph to be this household manager. So we've got the favorite son who becomes the rejected slave, and now he's this household manager. And at that point in the story, I am more inclined to say, oh, okay. Well, now God's with Joseph because he's on the upswing. But then, when he's in Potiphar's house, you've got this whole episode with him and Potiphar's wife. And again, I can't get my head around this. Joseph makes what is perhaps the greatest decision of integrity in the entire Old Testament. Potiphar's wife's coming up to him, come to bed with me. You know she's not ugly. And Joseph, even though God has completely abandoned him, he has the moral fiber and the integrity to say, no, I'm not going to do that. And what does he get for that? He's falsely accused of a crime he didn't commit, and he gets sent to jail. And then, again, the Bible has the audacity to say that God was with him. Genesis 39, while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. How can the Bible say that? Joseph just did the right thing. He made the right decision, and he gets thrown in jail? And then you're telling me, oh yeah, God's there, God's with him. That doesn't make any sense to me. How can you say that God is with Joseph when nothing in the story says that God's doing anything? God's just standing there. He's not preventing one thing from happening to Joseph. You might think about it this way. Imagine a 15-year-old boy. His parents abandon him. He finds himself at a bank one day. Someone else robs the bank while he's standing there, and he gets accused of robbing that bank and gets thrown in prison. Are you going to visit him in prison and say, hey, don't worry, God's with you? You would never say that, because that would be offensive to the person. When you're in tragedy, you're not concerned with the God who's supposed to be with you. You're concerned about why God didn't prevent that. That's the question we want to ask when the bad things happen. Why wouldn't God prevent that from happening? You're going through a divorce, or someone you know is going through a divorce. The question you're asking is, why can't God prevent that? God's powerful enough. He created the world. Why couldn't he prevent it? You have a loved one that's sick, and you're praying every single day that that person will be healed. And if that person does not get healed, and if that person dies, the question you're going to be asking is, why couldn't God prevent that? Why can't he prevent the things? Because you know he's powerful enough to do it. C.S. Lewis said it this way. He said, every war, famine, or plague, and almost every deathbed is the monument to a petition that was not granted. So when you go through stuff, in other words, it's kind of like this. You're asking God to do something, but he's not stopping it. And so the question we have is, why aren't you stopping these things? And so Joseph, when he's sitting there in prison, he's got to be thinking, God, why didn't you stop me from being thrown in the pit? And why didn't you prevent the slave traders from happening to be coming down the road that day? And why didn't you stop Potiphar's wife? Again, how can we say that God's with Joseph when God has done nothing? He's done nothing in the story thus far. So once again, the story doesn't explain itself at this point. The narrative just continues, and so you've got this favorite son who becomes a rejected slave, who becomes a promising manager, and then he becomes this forsaken prisoner. And so Joseph is in this pit. He's in prison. He's there for years. he meets these two guys, the cupbearer and the baker. He interprets their dreams. Cupbearer gets out of jail, and Joseph says, please don't forget me in here. Cupbearer gets out of jail, and guess what? He forgets Joseph. A few years later, Pharaoh has some dreams, and that's when the cupbearer finally remembers Joseph. And then in this bizarre turnaround, Pharaoh calls Joseph out of prison to interpret these dreams. The dreams are about this big famine coming in on the land, and Pharaoh appoints Joseph to be the one to save the world from this impending famine. And so if you're tracking with the story, Joseph goes from favorite son to rejected slave, promising manager, forsaken prisoner, and now he's the prince of Egypt. And so his story is going up and down and up and down and up and down. And at the low moments, I'm tempted to say, how can you say God is with you? It's the high moments that I want to say, yes, that's when God is with Joseph. But the Bible says that God is with Joseph in these valleys just as much as he is in the mountains. Now, when you get to the second half of the story of Joseph, I kind of want to summarize some things, because when you're kind of reading along and you get to the part where the brothers start making these trips to Egypt, there's the first trip, there's the second trip, there's all these sacks of grain stuff, there's the silver cup, all of that kind of gets confusing. So let me truncate it all. Here's kind of in summary what is going on with the story of Joseph. All these terrible things happened to Joseph. They began with this really interesting moment where the brothers had to make this decision. Are we going to let one of our youngest brothers, Joseph, are we going to let him go into slavery in Egypt, or are we going to take him back home with us? And Judah gave that speech after the pit, and that's why Joseph went into Egypt. Well, Joseph goes through all the zigzag stuff. Now he's the prince of Egypt. He's in charge. The brothers come back to him. They don't recognize it's Joseph. Joseph knows it's them. And Joseph puts them through a series of tests to see if their hearts have changed. So all the cup and the sack stuff, it's all to get the brothers to this moment where now Joseph has Benjamin, and Joseph says, all right, guys, you can go home. I'm going to keep Benjamin as my slave. So in other words, Joseph forces them to make a decision. What are we going to do about our youngest brother about to go to slavery? Are we going to let him go into slavery, or are we going to do something about it? And at this point in the story, Judah gets up. Of all people, Judah gets up, and he gives this incredible speech. Here's what he says. Please let your servant, he's talking about himself, Judah, please let me remain here as my Lord's slave in place of the boy, and let the boy return with his brothers. How can I go back to my father if the boy's not with me? No, don't let me see the misery that would come on my father. So in other words, Judah, the same guy who said years earlier, 16 years earlier, you know what, Joseph, we'll just sell you to as an Egyptian slave. That same guy now gives a speech and says, over my dead body is Benjamin going to be a slave. So we have this complete reversal where there is change happening with these brothers. And we learn in the Bible that they remember what they did to Joseph. In fact, their guilt has stayed with them for 16 years. They know they sold him. They think he's dead, then this guilt has been with them all along and all along. And so we get to this crucial moment when Judah makes this speech, and then we get to the climax of the story of Joseph. You see, when Judah gives this speech, and Joseph sees his heart change, he breaks down. Everything changes at this moment. Joseph is about to reveal himself to his brothers, and we are about to understand why everything happened. See, the whole story of Joseph leads up to chapter 45, and in chapter 45, that's when God tells us what's going on. So here's what Joseph says. Brothers are standing there. Judah's just made his speech. Joseph gets up and says, I am your brother, Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that, this is so important, that God sent me here. God sent me ahead of you. It was God who sent me. And so this is a huge moment in the book of Genesis, because Joseph is like figuring some things out. I mean, think of everything that is happening in this moment. You've got these 12 guys, probably in their 40s and 50s, who are weeping and hugging each other. And you've got these brothers who have been steeped in guilt for 16 years, and now they find their guilt being melted away in the face of resilient forgiveness. You've got Judah, this guy who made the speech to sell Joseph into slavery. Now he gives a speech to sacrifice his own life. So you've got this guy who's bent on hatred at one point, and now he's a man of grace. And then in the middle of this whole cluster, you've got Joseph standing in the middle, and I think that he figures out at this moment what he knew in his heart all along. You see, the story kind of hints at this, but I think everything comes to a head in this cluster of men weeping together, and Joseph figures it out. And this is what he figured out. He figured out that God could have prevented the pit from happening. God could have prevented the prison from happening. God could have prevented the lie from Potiphar's wife from happening. God could have prevented the cupbearer from forgetting Joseph, but Joseph figured it out. God is much more than a preventer. He's a redeemer. You see, God's not really in the business of pain prevention. He's in the business of pain redemption. And the problem comes in because you and I, we're always looking for the God who's going to prevent pain. We want the God that's going to come in before the tragedy happens and take it away because we don't want to go through it. But what Joseph tells us is that God, he's the type of God that takes jealousy, and he takes hatred, and he takes imprisonment, and he puts them all together. And he makes redemption. That's the God that you serve. And so the whole book of Genesis just leads us up to the very last chapter of this book, chapter 50, when there's one line, one verse in Genesis chapter 50, which I think summarizes the whole book, and it's so simple. You intended this for harm, but God intended it for good. See, that's the God you serve. You serve the God that takes anything, wickedness, evil, pain, he turns it into good. So in 1973, one of the lead architects in the whole country was known as Minoru Yamakasugi. And he had spent 15 years of his life designing what would be at that time the tallest building in the world. Now, he didn't want it just to be the tallest building, he also wanted it to be the safest building. And so he put in a lot of safety measures to make sure that this building could withstand a lot of destruction. This building was to have 59 unique columns built into the external structure of the building. And those 59 steel columns were supposed to help the building if big wind damage was ever to come to that building. Thousands and thousands of man-hours were spent on the preventative measures for these two buildings. Well, 38 years later, on September 11th, 2001, two planes hit what we know as the World Trade Center. None of the preventative measures could have stopped the devastation that happened on that day when those planes came and hit those buildings. Now, I want to show you this other picture because I love this picture. After the buildings came down, someone snapped a shot of this guy right here. We don't know his name, but we do know the story of what he was doing here. This is in the aftermath of September 11th, which we just remembered a few weeks ago, and the firemen had looked through rubble for a while, and most of them had cleared the area. Makeshift hospitals were popping up on the streets. People were leaving the scene with blood running down their face, with tears streaming down their face. The whole country was in shock, but everybody was leaving ground zero. And this guy walked back into the middle of the rubble all by himself, calling for anybody who had survived. He just walked right into the middle of the rubble. Now here's what I want to ask you this morning. Which picture of God do you prefer? Do you like the God who designs it all, puts some safety measures in place, but then when the day of crisis comes, he sits up in his office? Or do you want the God who crawls into the rubble? That's the God that Genesis gives us. Genesis portrays a God which goes right into the heart of sin and evil and destruction to make something out of it. That's the God you serve. You see, going back to this moment where Joseph is with his brothers, I think that Joseph is having one of those moments. Maybe you've had these moments before. I think he's having one of those moments where he realizes how small he is in like a good way. I don't know if you've ever had that feeling before when you just realize that, wow, God's so big and I'm so small, and it's a good thing. Because if you think about it this way, all the bad things that happen in Joseph's life, they weren't just threats to Joseph, they were threats to God. And as you read through the story of Joseph, what you're thinking is, are any of these things going to stop God? Is the pit going to stop God? Is the prison going to stop God? Is the lies from Potiphar's wife, is that going to stop God? Is the prison sentence really going to stop God? And what we read, and this is so important to understand, when you read the story of Joseph, here's what comes so clear to me. God might not prevent your worst fears from happening, but your worst fears can never prevent the purposes of God from happening. I mean, think about that. What's your worst fear in the world? Your worst fear, I'm assuming, is that somebody you love is going to die. That's what many of our worst fears are. And while that fear might devastate your life, I'm telling you, that fear, it's not even going to touch the purposes of God. God's not going to stop everything from happening to us, but when those things do happen to us, guess what? It doesn't stop God. The pit couldn't stop God. The prison couldn't stop God. Nothing's going to stop God. He takes all this stuff, all this mess in the life of Joseph, and he turns it into redemption. I mean, this God is unstoppable. He's relentless to bring his love to the world, and he's going to do that with or without you. And so you've got to understand that as you sit in your pit, as you sit in your prison, as you sit in your despair, even though that's devastating to you, you've got to understand it's not going to stop God from doing his thing. He's going to restore the world. It's going to happen. And so as you sit in your pit, the easiest thing to do is to so desperately want to get out of the pit that you forget to look at the God who's with you. That's the message of Joseph, that as Joseph's life does this, we think God's with him in the peaks, but what the real message is, when you read those passages, the places in the life of Joseph where it says God is with him is when he's in the valley. So when you're down low, that's when you need to lean into the presence of God the most, because that's where you're going to find redemption. You might not necessarily find prevention, but I guarantee you're going to find redemption. So in 1979, Michael and Janet Sonnenberg were traveling back from a family vacation. And Janet was in one car, and Michael and his brother were in another car, and they were pulling up to a toll booth, and a semi lost its brakes. Semi slammed into the back of their cars. Caused a big explosion, and everybody jumped out of the cars. And both Michael and his brother thought that they had got Michael's 2-year-old son out of the back seat. But they didn't. And so for several minutes, this 2-year-old boy was strapped into a car seat while the flames were going. Finally, someone ran in and grabbed little Joel out of the car. Joel did not die, but he almost died. 85% of his body was burned. Lost his fingers, lost his ears, face was very disfigured, but he did survive. And whereas most people would think, oh, well, that's kind of the end of the story, that's good, I'm glad he survived, Joel's life took a complete turn for the worse as he grew up. Because even as a young boy, as his parents tell the story, Joel figured out that he was different. And Joel figured out, because nobody would look at him, he didn't get invited over to kids' houses, and so Joel, as much as depressed as kids can get, that's what happened to Joel. He thought that he was nothing. Well, Joel had good parents, and Joel's parents believed in Jesus, and one day they told Joel, they said, Joel, we don't care if nobody looks at you. You're going to learn to look at other people, and you're going to learn to love other people. And Joel's parents would actually take him to a mall, and they would put him in a stroller, and they would wheel him around this mall, and they would have him practice looking in the face of other people. And even though those people weren't looking at him, they wanted Joel to learn how to love. And so over and over and over, these parents just poured their love into the life of Joel. And they said, Joel, God is going to do something with your life. And so somewhere as Joel was growing up, something changed, and Joel finally realized that he wasn't a victim and that he could be a victor. And Joel went to high school, and he became the student body president of his high school. A few years later, Joel became the Citizen of the Year in the state of North Carolina. A few years later, Joel decided that because of what Jesus had done in his life, he wanted to go into ministry. And so he started touring the country speaking about his story in the name of Jesus. And at one of these speaking engagements, he met a woman after his speaking engagement, and they started talking even after that seminar. And a year later, Joel Sonnenberg got married. And then, a few years later after that, Abigail came into Joel's life. One of Joel's favorite lines that he says when he speaks around the nation is this. He says, "The Lord in his divine nature does not create accidents." And I would add to that, God doesn't cause accidents, but he can sure redeem them. And what happens with you and I is if we spend our whole lives looking for the God of prevention, we're going to miss the God of redemption. You see, some of you this morning are so stricken in your loss and your pain and with your burdens that you're forgetting to look right next to you to the God who promises that he's going to be with you. He is with you. And so what we want to do for the remainder of the worship service is we just want to let you play this out in your mind. We want you to worship the God who redeems, not just the God who prevents. And there's a couple ways we want you to experience this. One way is Scott's going to lead several songs here, and as we sing, one thing that we want to give you the opportunity to do is that we're going to pray together. There's going to be some people up right here in front of the stage and right here in front of the stage. They're going to be praying. There's going to be some people in the back that are praying. Some of you, there's stuff going on in your life. You need to go pray about it. I mean, think again, in your mind, imagine Joseph with his brothers. That moment, when those 12 guys got together, that is the climax of the entire book of Genesis. Powerful things happen when we get together and talk about things and pray about things. Some of you, you need to go pray as we sing these songs. Others of you, your life has been so messed up with sin, you need redemption through baptism. And today needs to be the day where you say, you know what, I'm done with my sin, God. I'm ready to give it to you. And you need to be baptized into the name of Jesus. If you want to pray, once you go to a group, if you want to get baptized, come find me. And if you're not going to do one of those things, we want you to sing with all your heart, not just to the God who prevents pain, but to the God that redeems it. Let's stand and let's sing.